It was the kind of Christmas Eve that looked peaceful from a distance. Silent, white, buried under 6 inches of fresh snow. But if you stepped closer to the peeling porch of the small house at the end of the lane, the peace was shattered by the violent rhythm of red and blue emergency lights. 5 county vehicles sat idling in the driveway, their exhaust plumbing gray into the freezing air. Inside the house, 55-year-old Elias Thorne wasn't holding a weapon. He was on his knees in the dark, clutching his 6-year-old granddaughter inside a nest of old quilts, trying to shield her eyes from the strobe lights cutting through the curtains. The man pounding on the front door was Vance, a Child Protective Services agent who prided himself on never making mistakes. He had the court order in his hand. He had the judgment in his eyes. He believed he was there to rescue a child from a negligent failure who couldn't even afford to heat his own home. But Vance was walking blind into a tragedy of his own making. Because what the agent didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know as he reached for the doorknob, was that the failure on the other side of that door was the only reason Vance's own daughter was still breathing tonight. Elias had traded his warmth to save a stranger. And now, the father of that stranger had come to take away the only thing Elias had left. The door latch clicked, the handle turned, and in the freezing silence between 2 heartbeats, the most devastating misunderstanding in this town's history was about to break. The silence inside the house was heavier than the blizzard raging outside. In the living room, the air was so cold that breath hung in white clouds, lingering like ghosts before fading into the dark. 55-year-old Elias sat on the edge of the sagging sofa, his arms wrapped tight around a small bundle of blankets. Inside that bundle was Mia, her 6-year-old frame trembling not from the temperature, but from the fear radiating off her grandfather. Outside, the world had turned into a nightmare of spinning lights. Red and blue strobes cut through the gaps in the moth-eaten curtains, painting the peeling wallpaper in violent, alternating colors. It looked like a crime scene. To the neighbors peering out from behind their warm windows across the street, it probably was. A heavy fist pounded against the front door again. The wood groaned under the force, the deadbolt rattling in its loose frame. "Mr. Thorne, open the door. We know you're in there." The voice was authoritative, flat, and devoid of any holiday spirit. It was the voice of the system. Elias looked down at the top of Mia's head. She was wearing her winter coat, a knit hat, and 2 pairs of socks. Yet she still felt fragile in his grip. She coughed, a dry, wheezing sound that made Elias's chest tighten. He pressed her face gently against his flannel shirt, trying to muffle the sound, trying to hide her from the men standing on his porch. "Grandpa?" she whispered. The word was barely a vibration against his ribs. "Are they going to take me?" Elias squeezed his eyes shut. The grease stains on his knuckles were permanent now, ingrained from 30 years of fixing engines that belonged to other people. Yet he couldn't fix the one thing that mattered tonight. He smoothed the hair back from her forehead, his rough palms snagging on the wool of her hat. "Hush now, baby girl," he murmured, his voice cracking. Just hold on to me." "This is Vance from Child Protective Services," the voice outside boomed, cutting through the wind. "We have a court order, Elias. Do not make us break this door down." The threat hung in the freezing air. Elias looked at the small electric heater in the corner of the room. It was unplugged, dark, and useless. He looked at the empty kitchen counter where a Christmas dinner should have been. Then he looked at the door. He knew what they saw from the outside. A condemned shack in a dying Rust Belt town inhabited by an old man who had finally run out of luck. They didn't see the love. They didn't see the sacrifice. They only saw the cold. And in the eyes of the state, a cold house was a dangerous house. The handle jiggled aggressively. The hinges shrieked. Elias tightened his hug one last time, inhaling the scent of baby shampoo and old wool that was distinctly Mia. He knew he had about 10 seconds before the wood splintered. He knew that once that door opened, the narrative of his life would no longer belong to him. It would belong to the paperwork, the assessments, and the man named Vance who stood in the snow, waiting to tear his world apart. But to understand why 5 government vehicles were parked on his lawn on Christmas Eve, you have to understand what happened 24 hours earlier, when the last $40 in Elias's pocket still felt like a fortune. 24 hours earlier, the enemy hadn't been the police or the government. It had been the silence. It started in the basement, a shuddering groan of metal that vibrated through the floorboards, followed by a long, defeated exhale. Then, the rhythmic hum of the forced air furnace, the heartbeat of the small wooden house, simply stopped. Elias was in the kitchen, washing a plate with water that was already running lukewarm. He froze, his hands slick with cheap dish soap, straining his ears against the sudden quiet. He waited for the kick-start, the roar of the pilot light catching, the familiar rattle of the fan. But the house just settled into a stillness that felt heavy and permanent. He dried his hands on his jeans and went down the stairs. The basement smelled of damp concrete and old dust. He knelt before the ancient furnace, a rusted beast from the 70s that he had kept alive with duct tape, prayers, and scavenged parts for years. He pressed the reset button. Nothing. He checked the pilot light window. It was a black eye staring back at him. He struck a match, his fingers steady despite the sinking feeling in his gut, and held it to the thermocouple. The flame flared blue, danced for a second, and then vanished as if the air itself had strangled it. The main control valve was shot. He knew it instantly. He was a mechanic. He knew the feel of dead machinery. "Grandpa?" Elias looked up. Mia was standing at the top of the stairs, silhouetted by the gray light of the hallway. She was holding her chest lightly, a habit she had developed over the last year. "Is the monster sleeping?" she asked. That's what she called the furnace because of the noise it made. "Yeah, baby," Elias lied, climbing the stairs slowly, his knees popping. "It's just taking a nap. Go put on your thick sweater, okay? The blue one." By noon, the temperature inside had dropped 10 degrees. The insulation in the walls had rotted away years ago, and without the heat, the house was little more than a windbreak against the Michigan winter. Elias sat at the kitchen table, staring at a white envelope. He didn't need to open it to know what was inside. 2 $20 bills, $40. It was everything until the first of the month. It was supposed to be for a turkey, maybe a small toy, and next week's milk. He looked over at Mia. She was coloring on the living room floor, but her breathing had changed. It was subtle, a faint whistle on the exhale that only a terrified parent would notice. The cold air was heavy. It triggered her asthma. Elias walked over and picked up her inhaler from the side table. He gave it a shake. It felt terrifyingly light. There were maybe 10 doses left, maybe 5. If the cold triggered an attack tonight, this canister wouldn't last until morning. The choice sat in his throat like a stone. A refill for the albuterol cost $35 without insurance. A used space heater at the pawn shop downtown, he had seen one in the window yesterday, would probably cost the same. He couldn't afford both. If he bought the medicine, they would freeze. If he bought the heater, he could keep the air warm enough to stop her chest from tightening in the first place. He had to gamble on prevention, He had to gamble that warmth was the better medicine. Elias shoved the $40 into his pocket. He grabbed his coat and knelt next to Mia. He pulled her hood up, tucking her hair inside. "I have to go out for a bit," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm going to go get us some heat. I'm going to make it warm enough for Santa, okay?" Mia looked up, her eyes wide and trusting. "Don't be long, Grandpa. The windows are getting frosty." "I'll be back before you know it," he promised. He stepped out into the biting wind, the door latching with a sharp metallic snap behind him. He walked with his head down, fighting the gusts, clutching the bills in his pocket as if they were a lifeline. He didn't know that he was walking toward a test that would cost him far more than $40. The bell above the door of Miller's Pawn and Loan announced Elias's arrival with a sharp, frantic jingle that sounded too cheerful for the business being conducted inside. The shop smelled of stale cigarette smoke, dust, and the peculiar, metallic scent of other people's bad luck. Elias stomped the snow off his boots and scanned the cluttered shelves. Guitars with missing strings hung from the ceiling like cured meats, and rows of power tools sat silent and greasy behind a wire mesh. But Elias only had eyes for the floor near the back counter. There it was, an oil-filled radiator heater, scuffed along the side, missing a wheel, but solid. The price tag, written in black marker on a piece of masking tape, read $35. Relief washed over him, so intense it almost made his knees buckle. He had enough, with $5 to spare for a jug of milk. He hauled the heater to the counter. It was heavy, awkward, and beautiful. Miller, the owner, didn't look up from his ledger. He was a man who had seen every version of desperation walk through his door and had long ago decided to stop caring about any of them. $35, Miller grunted. "No returns, as is." Elias reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the two crisp $20 bills. He was about to pull them out when the door chimed again. The girl who rushed in brought a gust of freezing wind with her. She was young, maybe 19, but she wore the city's hardness like a second skin. Her coat was too thin, unzipped over a faded hoodie, and her hands were shaking violently. To anyone else in the shop, she looked like a junkie looking for a quick fix. Her eyes were wide, darting, rimmed with red exhaustion. She bypassed Elias and slammed a small object onto the glass counter. A silver locket. It looked delicate against the scratched surface. "I need 80, she said. Her voice was brittle, high-pitched. "Please, it's real silver. Vintage." Miller finally looked up. He picked up the locket, turning it over in his thick fingers with agonizing slowness. He popped the latch. A tiny black and white photo of a smiling woman sat inside. "I'll give you 20, Miller said, dropping it back on the glass. 20? The girl's voice cracked. "The bus ticket alone is $68. I have to get to Cleveland tonight. Please, look at it again." "It's scrap silver, sweetheart. $20. Take it or walk." Elias stood frozen, his hand still in his pocket. He watched the girl's face crumble. It wasn't the angry disappointment of an addict denied cash. It was the sheer, suffocating panic of a child. "My mom," she whispered. And the fight drained out of her, leaving only a terrifying vulnerability. "The hospital said she won't make it to morning. I just need to hold her hand one more time." Miller sighed, a sound of supreme boredom. "Not my problem. You want the 20 or not?" "I can't get there with 20, she screamed, the sound tearing at her throat. "Then get out. You're scaring the customers." Miller gestured vaguely at Elias. The girl snatched the locket back, her knuckles white. She spun around, her eyes meeting Elias's for a fraction of a second. In that instant, Elias didn't see a stranger. He saw the ghost of his own daughter, the way she had looked in the hospital bed years ago, scared and fading. He saw the same desperation he felt every time he looked at Mia. She stormed out. The bell jingled again, mocking the silence she left behind. "Crazy," Miller muttered. "You buying this heater or what?" Elias looked at the heater. He imagined the coil warming up, the orange glow, the way Mia's breathing would ease into a steady rhythm. It was safety. It was survival. Then he looked at the door. Through the display window, he could see the girl. She had collapsed onto the sidewalk, heedless of the snow soaking into her jeans. She wasn't calling anyone. She wasn't looking for another shop. She was just sitting there, head buried in her knees, rocking back and forth. The cold outside was deadly, but the cold inside Elias, the cold of walking away, was worse. "Cold don't kill you," his father used to say. "Regret does." Elias looked at the heater one last time. He touched the cold metal fins. "No," Elias said. The word was quiet, foreign in his own mouth. Miller blinked. "What? I don't need it. Suit yourself." Elias turned and walked out of the shop. The wind hit him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. He walked up to the girl. She didn't look up. She was making a low, keening sound that was lost in the traffic noise. Elias didn't say anything. He didn't want a speech. He didn't want gratitude. He just wanted the burning in his chest to stop. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the two $20 bills, his entire world, Mia's entire safety net, and crouched down. "Hey," he said. She looked up. Her face was streaked with mascara and tears, a mask of tragedy. Elias held out the money. "It's 40. It's not enough for the whole ticket, but maybe it gets you close enough." She stared at the bills, then at his face, trying to find the catch. "Why?" "Your mom," Elias said, his voice rough. "Don't let her wait." He pressed the money into her freezing hand, closed her fingers over it, and stood up. He turned and walked away fast, heading back toward the 4-mile stretch of road that led to his freezing house. He didn't look back. If he looked back, he might vomit from the panic rising in his throat. He had done the right thing. He knew that. But as he walked into the deepening dark, the only thing he could think of was Mia's wheezing chest, and the lie he was going to have to tell her when he opened the door, or empty-handed. The walk home felt less like a journey and more like a sentencing. By the time Elias turned onto his street, the sensation in his toes had turned from a sharp sting to a dull, wooden numbness. The wind had picked up, driving snow horizontally across the pavement, burying his footprints seconds after he made them. He stood at the end of his driveway, looking up at the house. It was dark, save for the weak amber glow of the porch light he kept on for Mia. Without the hum of the furnace venting from the side, the house seemed to crouch in the darkness, lifeless and hollow. He touched the pocket where the money used to be. It was empty, a void that felt heavier than lead. He brushed the snow from his shoulders before opening the door, trying to leave the winter outside. But the moment he stepped in, the air inside hit him. It wasn't just cool. It was stagnant, a stillness that had already begun to seep into the furniture and the walls. "Grandpa?" Mia was exactly where he had left her, buried under a pile of Afghans on the sofa. Her voice was small, muffled by the wool. She sat up as he entered, her eyes searching his hands. "Did you get it?" she asked. "Did you get the heater?" Elias closed the door and locked it, taking a long moment to hang up his coat so he wouldn't have to look at her immediately. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm of guilt. I got the part to fix it," he lied. The words tasted like ash. But it's tricky, Mia. It's going to take a long time to start working. Maybe all night. He turned to face her. She looked disappointed, shrinking back into her blankets. It's still cold, she whispered. I know, baby. I know. Elias crossed the room and knelt beside her. He rubbed his hands together until the friction created a spark of heat, then cupped her face. Her skin was cool to the touch, too cool. But we're going to play a game tonight. We're going to camp out, like we did in the backyard that one summer, remember? He didn't wait for an answer. He moved to with a manic energy, stripping the cushions off the chairs, pulling the heavy quilt from his own bed, gathering every towel and spare sheet the house possessed. He built a nest in the center of the living room floor, away from the drafty windows. Come on, he coaxed, lifting her into the pile of bedding. Deep in the middle, that's the rule. He tucked her in, layering the blankets until she was a small mound of fabric, leaving only her face exposed. Then he climbed in beside her. He kept his flannel shirt and jeans on, wrapping his arms around her small frame, curling his body around hers to act as a human shield against the room. Is the monster going to wake up soon? Mia asked, her voice drifting. She was tired, her energy drained by the effort of keeping warm. Soon, Elias whispered into her hair. Go to sleep, Mia. When you wake up, Santa will be here. The house settled into silence. But Elias didn't sleep. He lay there in the dark, his eyes adjusting to the shadows stretching across the ceiling. The cold began to creep in, insidious and slow. He could feel it pressing down on the blankets, searching for a gap to enter. Every hour, the temperature dropped another degree. The frost began to form intricate, cruel patterns on the inside of the window panes. Elias focused entirely on the rhythm of Mia's breathing. Inhale, whistle, exhale, pause, inhale, whistle, exhale, pause. It was a terrifying lullaby. Every time the pause lasted a second too long, panic flared in his chest, sharp and electric. He would tighten his grip, rubbing her back, willing his own body heat to transfer into her lungs to loosen the tightness he knew was building there. Around 3 a.m. she stirred. She coughed, a dry barking sound that echoed in the empty room. Elias sat up instantly, fumbling for the inhaler in the dark. I've got you, he murmured, his hands shaking. Breathe out, baby, all the way out. He triggered the canister. The hiss of the medicine sounded like a gunshot in the quiet. Mia inhaled, shuddered, and slumped back against him. The canister felt empty now, weightless. Elias lay back down, pulling the quilt up over his head, creating a small pocket of carbon dioxide and warmth for them to share. He stared into the blackness of the blanket cave, tears finally leaking from the corners of his eyes. He thought of the girl at the pawn shop. He hoped she was on a bus. He hoped her mother was still alive. He hoped his sacrifice had bought someone some peace, because right now, lying in the freezing dark with his sick grandchild, he felt like the worst failure in the history of fathers. He didn't know that outside. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the world perfectly white and silent. He didn't know that a neighbor across the street, an insomniac named Mrs. Gable, was looking out her window. Noticing the lack of exhaust from his chimney and the dark, lifeless look of the house, he didn't know she was already reaching for her phone, dialing 3 numbers that would turn his bad night into a morning catastrophe. Elias just held on to Mia, fighting the cold, praying for the sun to rise before the frost reached her heart. Morning did not bring warmth. It only brought visibility to the misery. The sun dragged itself over the horizon, a pale, milky disk behind the overcast sky, casting a gray light into the living room. Elias woke with a gasp, his body jerking out of a dream where he was drowning in ice water. For a second, he didn't know where he was. Then the ache in his joints settled in. sharp and familiar. He was stiff, his legs cramping from remaining in the same curled position for 6 hours. He looked down. Mia was still asleep, her face buried in the crook of his arm. Her breathing was shallow, a thin, reedy sound. But she was breathing. He exhaled, his own breath pluming white in the stagnant air of the living room. They had made it. They had survived the night. He carefully extracted his arm, wincing as the blood rushed back into his numb fingers. He needed to get up. He needed to find a way to boil water, maybe start a small fire in the backyard grill to heat some bricks, anything to bring the temperature up before she woke. Then, the world outside exploded in color. Blue and red lights washed across the ceiling, reflecting off the frost on the windows. Tires crunched heavily on the gravel driveway, not one car, but a convoy. Doors slammed in rapid succession, the heavy metallic thuds of authority arriving in force. Elias froze. His heart slammed against his ribs. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the pain in his knees, and moved to the window. Through the gap in the curtains, he saw them. 5 black SUVs. The county sheriff's emblem on the side. Men in uniforms moving with tactical precision. And walking toward the porch was a man in a long wool coat, holding a clipboard like a weapon. Mrs. Gable, Elias thought, glancing across the street. The curtain in her window twitched and fell back. She had called them. She had seen the dark chimney, the dead house, and she had made the call that every struggling parent in America dreads more than death. The pounding on the door began. It wasn't a request, it was a demand. "Mr. Thorne, open the door." Mia jolted awake. She sat up in the nest of blankets, her eyes wide and glassy, confusion quickly morphing into terror as the shouting continued. "Grandpa?" Her voice was a terrified squeak. Elias rushed back to her, grabbing her shoulders. "It's okay, Mia. Stay there. Stay in the blankets." He moved to the door. He had to stop them from breaking it down. He couldn't afford a new door. He unlocked the deadbolt, his fingers clumsy with cold and fear. The door swung open, pushed by a gloved hand from the outside. The cold air from the yard rushed in, but it made no difference. The temperature inside the house was nearly the same. A wall of law enforcement stood on his porch. The man in the wool coat stepped forward, crossing the threshold without waiting for an invitation. He was tall, clean-shaven, with eyes that had seen too many broken homes to hold any sympathy left. "Elias Thorne?" the man asked. He didn't wait for an answer. He looked at a device in his hand, a thermal scanner. He pointed it at the wall, then at the floor. He grimaced. "It's 28 degrees in here, Mr. Thorne." "The furnace died yesterday," Elias stammered, backing up as the officers filled the small hallway. "I have a plan. I was going to fix it today. I just needed—" "You have a minor in the home." The man cut him off. His voice was calm, bureaucratic, and utterly devastating. "I'm Vance, Child Protective Services. We received a report of child neglect and unsafe living conditions." Vance walked past Elias, his expensive shoes crunching on the dirty floorboards. He looked at the kitchen, the empty counters, the open fridge that Elias hadn't bothered to close because the house was a refrigerator anyway. Then he looked at the living room. He saw the pile of old blankets on the floor. He saw the small, trembling shape of Mia sitting in the middle of it, wearing her coat and hat inside her own home. Vance turned back to Elias, his expression hardening. "This isn't a home, Mr. Thorne. It's an icebox. You have a child with a documented history of respiratory issues sleeping on the floor in freezing temperatures." "We were camping," Elias pleaded, his voice rising in desperation. He moved between Vance and Mia, his hands held up in surrender. I kept her warm. Look at her, she's fine. I ran out of money for the part. I get paid on the 1st. Please, just give me a day. I can't give you an hour, Vance said. He signaled to a female officer standing by the door. The environment is an immediate threat to the child's safety. Section 306. We are enacting an emergency removal. The words hung in the air, sharper than the frost. Removal. No, Elias whispered. Then louder. No, you can't take her. She's all I have. Grab the girl, Vance said to the officer. No. Elias lunged, instinct overriding logic. He reached for Vance's arm, a desperate, foolish attempt to stop the machine. 2 deputies were on him instantly. They didn't hit him. They just immobilized him with practiced efficiency, pinning his arms behind his back and pressing him against the freezing wall. The cold plaster burned his cheek. "Grandpa!" Mia screamed. It was a high, thin sound that tore through the room. The female officer approached the blanket nest. She was gentle, her face soft with apology, but her hands were firm. "Come here, honey, it's okay. We're going to go somewhere warm." "I don't want to go." Mia kicked at the blankets, scrambling backward until she hit the sofa. She reached out a small hand toward Elias. "Grandpa, tell them we're playing camping." Elias struggled against the deputies, tears hot and angry running down his face. "She needs her medicine. She has asthma. You're scaring her. That's what makes it worse." "We have medical staff waiting in the vehicle," Vance said, marking something on his clipboard. He didn't look at the crying girl. He couldn't afford to. If he looked at the individual tragedy, he couldn't do the job of saving the life. "You are being cited for child endangerment, Mr. Thorne. You have the right to a hearing in 72 hours. The officer picked Mia up. She was so small in the woman's arms. She flailed, her red mitten catching on the officer's collar, her eyes locking onto Elias. "Grandpa," she sobbed, her chest hitching, the wheeze becoming audible now. "I love you, Mia," Elias shouted, his voice breaking into a jagged ruin. "I'm coming for you. I promise. I'm coming." And then they were gone. The door didn't slam. It was left wide open. Vance walked out last, tapping his pen against his leg, leaving Elias pinned against the wall by a deputy who slowly released him once the child was secure in the SUV. "Stay here, sir," the deputy muttered, stepping back and walking out, pulling the door shut behind him. Elias stood alone in the center of the silent room. The silence was different now. Yesterday, it had been the silence of a broken machine. Now, it was the silence of a broken life. He fell to his knees on the pile of blankets where Mia had just been sleeping. He grabbed the pillow she had used, burying his face in it, inhaling the fading scent of her shampoo. He screamed, a raw, guttural sound that no one outside heard over the revving of the SUV engines. He had saved the girl at the pawn shop. He had done the right thing. And the universe had rewarded him by taking the only thing he had left. Outside, the convoy began to pull away, taking the warmth, the color, and the reason for his existence with them. Elias stayed on the floor, shivering, as the cold finally claimed the house completely. The interior of the government SUV was suffocatingly warm. The heater blasted from the dashboard vents, a stark, aggressive comfort that felt less like relief and more like an insult to the scene in the rearview mirror. Vance sat in the passenger seat, the leather creaking as he adjusted his posture. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, avoiding the rearview mirror where the little girl, Mia, sat strapped into a booster seat. She had stopped screaming. Now, she was just making small, rhythmic hitching sounds, staring out the window as her neighborhood blurred into a smear of white and gray. Vance tapped his pen against the clipboard. Case number 409-22. Emergency removal. Cause, neglect due to environmental hazard. He told himself it was clean. He told himself it was necessary. He had seen frostbite on children in homes like that. He was saving her. But as the convoy merged onto the highway, heading toward the county shelter, the image of the old man kneeling on the dirty floor, clutching a pillow, wouldn't leave his mind. There was a desperation in that house that felt different. It wasn't the apathy of an addict or the cruelty of an abuser. It was the sheer, jagged panic of a man drowning. His phone buzzed in the cup holder. A long, persistent vibration. Vance frowned. He checked the screen. Chloe. His stomach tightened. He hadn't spoken to his daughter in 3 weeks. Not since the argument about money, about her lifestyle, about the losers she hung out with. She had stormed out, disappearing into the city's underbelly. He had spent the last week waiting for a call from a hospital or a precinct. He hesitated, glancing at the deputy driving, then answered. Chloe? His voice was guarded. Dad? The voice on the other end wasn't the angry, defensive tone he expected. It was soft, broken, and it was echoing against tile walls. Where are you? Vance asked, sitting up straighter. Are you okay? I'm in Cleveland, Dad. At the hospital. I made it. Vance blinked, confused. Cleveland was 200 miles away. You're with your mother? Yeah. She's still holding on. Barely. But I got here. I'm holding her hand right now. Chloe let out a breath that sounded like a sob. She knows I'm here, Dad. She squeezed my fingers. Vance felt a lump form in his own throat. His ex-wife had been dying of cancer for months, a slow decline that had torn the remnants of their family apart. I'm glad, honey. I'm really glad. How did you get there? You said you were broke. I was, Chloe said. I was stuck in Detroit. I was at this pawn shop trying to sell Mom's locket. The guy wouldn't take it. I was going to give up, Dad. I was sitting in the snow thinking it was over. Vance listened, his eyes drifting back to the file on his lap. He saw the carbon copy of the citation he had just written. Elias Thorne, unemployed, indigent. Then this man came out, Chloe continued, her voice gaining a strange, reverent strength. He was old. He looked like he was having a worse day than me. His clothes were covered in grease, and he looked so cold. Vance's hand stopped tapping. He had just tried to buy a heater, Chloe said. I heard him inside. He needed it for his house. But he came out and gave me his money, all of it, $40. He told me to go to Mom. He said the cold outside doesn't kill you, regret does. Vance froze. The air in the SUV suddenly felt thin. He walked away with nothing, Dad. He gave a stranger his last dollar so I could see Mom before she died. Chloe paused. I never got his name, but I remember he was buying a heater, an old radiator style. He put it back on the counter. Vance looked down at the paperwork in his lap. Specifically, at the section he had filled out regarding the home inspection. Observation: 1 non-functional forced air unit. No auxiliary heating sources found. He remembered the old man's pleading voice in the hallway. I had the money. I was going to fix it. I ran out. The pieces clicked together with the force of a physical blow. The timing, the lack of heat, the reason the man was broke. Elias hadn't spent the money on booze. He hadn't gambled it. He hadn't lost it. He had given it to Chloe. Vance looked at the timestamp on the report. 8:30 a.m. The man sitting in that freezing house, The man Vance had just labeled a failure and a danger to his child was the only reason Vance's daughter wasn't standing alone in the snow right now. Elias had chosen to freeze so that Vance's daughter could have closure. A wave of nausea rolled over him. It was a sickening, vertigo-inducing realization of just how wrong he had been. He wasn't the hero of this morning. He was the villain. "Dad, are you there?" "I'm here," Vance whispered. His voice trembled. "I'm here, Chloe. Tell your mom. Tell her I'm sorry." "I will. Merry Christmas, Dad." "Merry Christmas." Vance ended the call. The phone slipped from his hand and fell onto the floor mat. He stared at the windshield, at the gray highway stretching out before them. He looked at the deputy driving. "Turn around," Vance said. The deputy glanced at him, confused. "Sir, we're 10 minutes from the shelter. Processing is waiting." "I said turn around," Vance barked, the command tearing out of his throat so loud that Mia jumped in the back seat. "Turn the damn car around, now." "We can't just release a child without a hearing, Vance. The paperwork is filed. It's in the system." "Then I'll burn the system down," Vance said, his hands shaking as he grabbed the radio handset. "This is Unit 4. Cancel the intake at County. We are returning the minor to the domicile. I am striking the citation." "On what grounds?" the deputy asked, slowing the vehicle, bewildered by the sudden shift in the rigid bureaucrat beside him. Vance looked back at Mia. She was watching him with wide, terrified eyes. Clutching the seatbelt, he saw the same fear in her that Chloe must have had yesterday. "On the grounds," Vance said, his voice breaking, "that I made a mistake. A massive mistake." He looked out the window as the SUV swung around in the emergency turnaround lane. The tires kicked up a spray of snow, reversing their course. "Get us back to that house," Vance ordered, pointing a trembling finger at the horizon. "And stop at a hardware store on the way. We're not going back empty-handed." Elias hadn't moved from the floor. Time had lost its structure. He didn't know if minutes or hours had passed since the taillights of the SUV vanished. He was just a hollow shape in a freezing room, staring at the dust motes dancing in the gray light. He was waiting for the house to finally kill him, or for the silence to drive him mad. Then, the sound returned. It wasn't the aggressive crunch of tires braking hard, but the slow, hesitant roll of a heavy vehicle pulling into the driveway. An engine cut. A door opened, then another. Elias lifted his head, confused. Had they come back to arrest him? Had they forgotten a form? He dragged himself to his feet, his legs trembling with exhaustion. He didn't have the strength to fight anymore. He would let them take him. He would let them do whatever they wanted, as long as they told him Mia was safe. The front door, which he hadn't bothered to lock, pushed open. Elias braced himself for the handcuffs. Instead, a blur of pink and blue launched itself across the room. "Grandpa!" The impact nearly knocked him over. Mia slammed into his legs, burying her face in his stomach, sobbing with a frantic, hiccuping relief. Elias froze for a heartbeat, his brain unable to process the miracle, before his arms instinctively wrapped around her, pulling her up off the floor and holding her so tight that he could feel the frantic thumping of her heart against his own. "I'm here," he rasped, burying his nose in her cold hair. "I'm here, baby. I've got you." He looked up, tears blurring his vision, expecting to see a police officer coming to tear them apart again. Vance stood in the doorway, but the clipboard was gone. The authoritative posture was gone. The man looked deflated, human, stripped of the bureaucratic armor he had worn only an hour ago. In his hands, he wasn't holding a citation. He was holding a large, heavy box with a picture of an oil-filled radiator on the side. Behind him, the deputy was carrying 2 grocery bags. Elias stared at them, his breath hitching. I don't understand. Vance didn't speak immediately. He walked into the room, kicking the door shut behind him with his heel to seal out the wind. He set the box down in the center of the living room, right where the nest of blankets had been. He pulled a box cutter from his pocket, sliced the tape, and began unpacking the unit. His movements were precise, but his hands were shaking slightly. Mr. Thorne, Vance said, not looking up as he screwed the caster wheels onto the heater. I received a phone call on the way to the shelter. From my daughter. Elias held Mia tighter, shielding her. Your daughter? She's in Cleveland, Vance said. He paused, his hand resting on the cold metal of the new heater. He looked up, and for the first time, his eyes were wet. She told me she wouldn't have made it there if a man in a pawn shop hadn't given her $40, a man who needed a heater part. The silence that filled the room wasn't cold anymore. It was heavy with a sudden, suffocating realization. Elias stared at Vance, the connection snapping into place. The girl, the tears, the jagged desperation in the pawn shop. That was her? Elias whispered. Vance nodded. He stood up and plugged the heater into the wall. He turned the dial to the maximum setting. A small orange light flickered on, a tiny beacon of promise. You chose to freeze so she could say goodbye to her mother, Vance said, his voice thick. You saved my little girl from a lifetime of regret, Elias. The least I can do is make sure you don't lose yours. Vance reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the yellow carbon copy of the emergency removal order, the document that had condemned Elias as a failure. He held it up for a second, letting Elias see the damning words. Then he crumpled it into a ball and shoved it deep into his pocket. The citation is void, Vance said firmly. The case is closed. As far as the state of Michigan is concerned, this home is safe. The deputy set the grocery bags on the kitchen table. Got some roasted chicken, sir, and mashed potatoes. Still hot. Elias looked from the heater, which was already beginning to emit a faint, ticking warmth, to the food, and finally to the man who had come to destroy him and stayed to save him. The anger he had felt earlier evaporated, leaving only a profound, exhausting gratitude. He didn't say thank you. The words felt too small. He simply nodded, a slow, deep acknowledgement of one father to another. She's a good kid, Elias said softly, referring to Chloe. She loves her mama. She gets that from her dad, Vance replied, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. He checked his watch, regaining a fraction of his professional composure, though his eyes remained kind. We'll be going now. The heater is yours. It's a gift. Not from the department. From me. Vance walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the latch and looked back at the pair standing in the middle of the room. The old mechanic and the little girl, clinging to each other as the room began to thaw. Merry Christmas, Elias, Vance said. Merry Christmas, Elias replied. The door clicked shut. The engine started outside and faded into the distance. Elias carried Mia to the kitchen table. He unpacked the food, the smell of rosemary and butter filling the air, chasing away the smell of old dust. He sat Mia down and watched her eat, watched the color return to her cheeks, watched the fear slowly leave her eyes. The new heater hummed in the background, a steady, rhythmic sound. It wasn't the roaring monster of the old furnace. It was a quieter sound, a gentle sound. Elias sat back in his chair, his hands resting on the table. He looked out the window. The snow was still falling, covering the tracks of the SUVs, covering the footprints of the morning's trauma. The world outside was still freezing, still hard, still unforgiving. But inside, the air was getting warmer. Elias closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He had started the day with nothing. He had ended it with everything that mattered. He realized then that the girl in the pawn shop had been right, and his father had been right. The cold hadn't killed him. And because of 18 inches of snow and $40 of kindness, regret wouldn't kill him either. He opened his eyes, picked up his fork, and smiled at his granddaughter. "Eat up, Mia," he said. "It's finally Christmas." Sometimes, the coldest winters bring out the warmest hearts. Elias thought he was trading his comfort for a stranger's chance to say goodbye. He didn't know he was actually buying his own future. In a world obsessed with what we have, this story reminds us that the only thing we truly own is what we give away. If you believe that good deeds always come back around, even when the doors are closed and the fire has gone out, share this story. You never know who needs a little warmth tonight.